Hello, everyone. I'm Mervad Algeri with ISIA Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. On behalf of the Middle Eastern Studies Program and our office, I would like to welcome you all here this afternoon. We're honored to have Dr. Zeynep Arda with us today, all the way from Turkey. Dr. Arda is an associate professor and the department chair of the Visual Communication Design Department at İzmir University of Economics in Turkey. She received her PhD and the title Doctor Europeus Cum Laude in Communication Sciences at Universidad Jaume el Primero in Spain. Guided by her multicultural and multidisciplinary background and funded by the European Union Horizon 2020, she has been working on her research, the artistic migrant persona, in Turkey and abroad since 2017. Besides her academic work, she has worked professionally as a designer and a consultant with various international teams, companies, and brands. I would also like to welcome today our moderator for our discussion, Professor Victor de Villa. Professor de Villa is an associate professor of graphic design and illustration at UCL. Besides teaching, he is an illustrator and designer whose clients include Scholastic Book Fairs and the Orlando Weekly. He is also the founder of the Central Florida Illustrator Collective, Giant Illustrators. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Arda. Dr. Arda.
Thank you. I think it's been some time that we haven't seen so many people in a room all together with COVID and everything. I'm so happy and so excited to be here. Thank you very much, Global Perspectives and International Initiatives and Middle Eastern Studies for having me here. I'm really excited, so I'm going to stay here for a while and then maybe I'll come out from behind this. So today, maybe we lured you in with the title Artists in Exile, but maybe it is wider than that's what I want to tell you today here, because I have quite a complicated background, if you have heard from Mervad already. I've always worked in an interdisciplinary field because I graduated as a city planner. And then I had my MFA in graphic design and interaction design and eventually communication studies. And as you can imagine, these are already interdisciplinary fields, all of them in themselves. And transdisciplinary research is the buzzword today in academia, but I didn't know anything otherwise, let's say. So today I'm going to try to share how I actually put these together and how I try to put them to work. To do my share of contribution to the society, let's say. Because Artists in Exile is almost a sad perception of the issue, but what I'm going to tell you is not sad at all. So let's have it. Let me start by extending my thanks also to my colleague from my faculty and my research partner, Ina Karakterli, who designed this illustration and many others that you will see in this presentation. And even though I also migrated to places and as a creative person lived some of the issues that I'm going to talk about, I'm lucky enough to be in a faculty, a very liberal faculty of fine arts and design in Turkey, with a very understanding dean and director. So I'm able to research and talk in any way that I would like. So what I'm going to tell you today is part of a European Union funded project called Transmaking. And in this project, we have 16 countries, 13 universities, 10 NGOs, and more than 150 researchers. And we're all working to find out the role of art and design and culture in improving democracy for all. My research is only part of it. As I told you, there's more than 150 researchers working on it. And here, This artistic migrant persona is the result, not even resulted yet, but is a work in progress, let's say, of more than 60 interviews that I carried out within this project in Slovenia, in Turkey, in Italy, in France, in Cuba, with artists that have left their countries of origin behind and that have come to live in a new culture, in a new country. So let's begin. This is obviously a part of the lyric from a Morrissey song. Home, is it just a word or is it something you carry within you? But this was the starting point for this research because human beings do not have roots physically, but we do have deep roots in our cultures and where we live. And just like flowers or trees being plucked out of their ecologies, we tend to show different reactions to changing our locations. And I also did that, and I had difficulties sometimes a lot of pleasure in adapting to a new environment. But overall, it is a difficult process. And this is something besides COVID-19, of course. This is a big problem, a huge problem that we have today on Earth. A lot of people are displaced against their will because of wars, because of persecution, because of human rights abuses. More than 60 million people is displaced. And this is creating problems for the people that are displaced and also to where they arrive at. So we have to somehow smooth out this process. And when I started this research, I thought, because I come from a city planning background, I wasn't really happy with the role of design, because in city planning, we always work with public truth. And we pretend to know that we know what is good for the public at the end of the day. But design has changed a lot in the past decades. And designers have changed a lot as well. And instead of being at the cosmetic end of the design process, we started to empathize much more. First, we called people users, but now we're also backing up from that. And we call it human-centered design, we call it people-centered design. And we have learned to not work in isolation and not pretend that we know the problems of people, but instead to step out and to ask and to observe and to empathize with people for real. This changed the role of the designer in the society, and this also started to change the role of the designer in the process. It's not for making things prettier by now, it's more of designers in the decision-making process as well. As we exported the concept of design thinking to other disciplines as well, which I'm going to go over briefly because I think I have a different mix of an audience. I'm used to talking to designers. This is actually something that we have invented for non-designers to understand the weird process that we are going through to design. So let me go a little further. Talking about home, when we are visiting, we are just a passenger looking around and appreciating how things are different. But when it comes to settling in another culture, it starts to become a question mark for everyone from every background and every walk of life. And when you think you found it, sometimes it is a place, sometimes it is something physical, sometimes it is something welcoming in a culture. Most of the time, it's the people that you find your home in. And according to most of the dancers that I interviewed, it is their body or their language that they find as their home. So how to put these together without confusing you further? As a designer and as somebody that is used to going through these processes of how to put concepts together, how to empathize with people, and as someone who has studied communication sciences and as someone that knows that communication is not at all a science, I tried to put together the design methodology as a service of intercultural communication for this project, and to talk about the displaced populations and how they integrate in cultures to make something that Ezio Manzini defines as resilient societies. Once again, referencing it to the nature, we know that the more diverse an area is, the more resilient it is to changes, because it gives a lot of flexibility, obviously. And the societies do need this diversity and tolerance, let's say, not to break, to be flexible, to accept new situations and new stimuli, let's say. And these movements, the people that are displaced, the people that migrate from one culture to another, are at the core of this, in my opinion, because they show us an example of a better adaptation or better integration somehow. So I use them as a benchmark in the study to observe these experiences. And I did talk to them for hours and hours to see their experiences, see where they are tackling problems, what are the misunderstandings that they go through in intercultural communication. And I did listen to many of them. And I figured out that the open-mindedness that you achieve as a result of this, maybe somehow it comes from the creativity. Maybe they are, there's a chicken and egg situation. I mean, because they are artists or creative people, they have to be open-minded, or vice versa. However, I realized that they have a huge capacity in developing empathy and a huge capacity in communicating this to everybody else. When we come to art and, okay, this is another quote from somebody very important, or Vanessa. In sciences, we have put a lot of effort in investigating what differentiates people, that's true, and maybe not enough to figure out what brings them together. But this is actually the definition of identity as well. When we talk about art, migration, and identity, when we talk about identity in general, it is the common ground that we found with everybody else to define ourselves as similar to some people. And it is the differences that we find in ourselves to distinguish ourselves from the others as well. So identities of people, identities of countries, identities of communication, it is all boiling down to this. But finding the common grounds is finding the road to empathy, in my opinion, my humble opinion, let's say. In today's world, another beautiful illustration by Nina. In today's world, we are so used to minimizing things to these small, smiley faces, sometimes frowny faces. And we are very used to taking just a millisecond to think that we understood what the other person is feeling, that we communicated ourselves somehow with these funny little faces. But that's not the case most of the time, and let's admit it, we all know it. And in my research, this is one of the questions actually, because the laughing out loud emoji, the one that's crying, the tears in your eyes emoji, was the word of the year. It was selected as the word of the year 5 years ago, by now. And from that moment on, I found it really weird that it's not even a word, it's a visual, it's a shorthand for an emotion. And it is the most used emoji on earth. How does it become the word of the year? The thing, and if it becomes the word of the year, is the world really such a happy place that everybody is laughing out loud, really, and sharing it with emojis in each case? But everybody that I talked to had different meanings for these small faces, believe it or not. Nobody actually shares the emotion behind them. Everybody has different definitions for them. So when we think that we are communicating instantly, maybe we're not communicating at all. Maybe there's too much communication and too little communicators. This, when we are from the same culture. And think about it when we are not from the same culture. These are some of the artists, some of the artworks that have inspired me and affected me a lot all along. because they show the faces that we are prejudiced about. Shirin Neshat's work is beyond words in this case. But coming from instant communication with emojis and going to what happens, how art communicates, we have to stop and take a breath, of course. Like, we think we communicate instantly with the emojis, but art requires more time. It goes way deeper. You have to take your time, take your breath, and look at it and understand it and go into it to get the meaning. And that is why it affects us much more. And that is why it becomes much more efficient when it comes to intercultural communication. This was another work that had inspired me a lot in this project that I'm undertaking, Stepping Stones by Nizara Gebaber, a Syrian artist that had to migrate. I don't know if you know the story, but because he can't afford any other material, he uses stones to express and to tell his stories. And until recently, he wasn't even able to afford glue. So he would make up his work with the stones and take photographs and then tear it apart because he doesn't have glue to put together. So artists have a way of communicating even in the worst of conditions, even when they can't even afford the material to communicate. And they have the way of touching our hearts when they manage to communicate, just like this video artwork by Erkan Özgen that was presented in Istanbul some years ago. As we watch the trauma of a little Syrian boy, we start feeling, we start empathizing, we start going into these stories much more than we can do through little emojis, or maybe much more than we can do through the news. I'm not a big fan of calling it artists in exile, because to me it feels like just reporting what's going on, just like maybe a journalist reporting the problems, the traumas. But instead, I wanted to look for a way to figure out how to help. So it goes on, because this is a very recent work that I've come to see in Miami a couple of days ago. And when you are an outsider in a culture, this must be very close to how you feel. I mean, you want to be seen, but most of the time you become part of the background. When we say migrants, artists or otherwise, we seem to talk about, we feel at least that that's a homogeneous crowd, migrants, and they're all similar. They all have similar needs, maybe. That's never the case. And as all human beings, migrants, refugees, expats, whoever you want to call the displaced, though their problems are much different than one another. We are all human beings in the end that need expression, that need their identities, that need recognition, and that need communication. Migrants and patients, people that are sick, are the groups that need communication the most, according to all research, and that are able to communicate the least. I think we've all seen the very sad stories in the case of COVID-19 in the past years. But in the case of migrants, we seem to tend to see them still as a homogeneous crowd and not to see their faces or identities also. That's where art steps in. This is another work that I've also seen recently here from Sandra Ramos. I forgot to, here it comes. So this is a good summary of what I tried to tell you from Sandra Ramos, who is the author of this work, a Cuban artist. Then let's see what design can do in this circumstance without extending its work. When we say design thinking, for us designers, it's thinking already. It's not thinking in a similar way. It's not thinking with induction and deduction in the familiar logic of things, but it is thinking through abductive reasoning, which is looking for what may be, what is possible, what can we do about this, what is the proposal that we can bring in. This is a very common example when we are talking about design thinking. I don't know if you are familiar with the problem, and most of us are used to hearing it as thinking out of the box, maybe. But this is the truck that couldn't pass under a bridge because it was higher than the clearance, obviously. And it blocked the way, as you can imagine. Does anybody know how it got out? Or how they thought around it? Because pure logic tells us that it shouldn't be there anyway, and it cannot pass because it is higher than the clearance. And science, when we think about induction, it says, okay, we shouldn't do this in similar situations. But none of these ways of thinking take us out of the situation in the end. Anybody wants to, yeah, please.
Is this the case where the child in the car driving by says to let the air out of the tire?
Yeah, that is exactly the case, yes. Because the children usually have a different way of looking at things. And looking at it from another perspective, it's obvious to us now, like after we hear it from the child, that if we lower the tires, it's going to get lower, the truck, and it can be pulled out easily. So this way of thinking is what we call design thinking in the end. That we look for different creative solutions. And now that we have figured out that this kind of working and this kind of thinking works for resolving a lot of situations, that we can repeat this process and come up with creative answers to many questions. We got a bit bolder as designers. No, we can apply this to many things, and we can be more helpful for the world instead of decorating it, maybe. This is a definition of design as anyone who devises courses of action aimed at improving existing situations is a designer. And Ezra Manzini actually talks about this in his book, Design When Everybody Designs, when he is defining the resilient society as a creative one. And here are some quotes from a very intelligent human being. If we don't change our way of thinking, we cannot change the society or the problems that we have created. So this is how design thinking works and how it puts us through a process. These are the cycles that we keep drawing around ourselves to come to solutions, but this is actually an efficient way of thinking. We try to understand, empathize with people. We try to define the problem, and most of the problems that we have in today's world are wicked problems. They are ill-defined problems. It is not really possible to minimize them into small questions so that we can come up with practical answers. So these drawing circles around them actually might help us with a lot of focus, I think. So developing empathy and the logic of design, I already talked about this. What happens with a society that allows for creativity? Well, now that we are in Florida, I think it makes sense to quote Richard Florida, who wrote The Rise of the Creative Class, a very successful book as an urban theorist that talks about cities and their compositions and how people come together to make them resilient. And Richard Florida thinks creativity as a human quality is not only nice, but also has a very important economic value. Like the cities that have the tolerance to attract the creative populations have a way ahead in economic terms. And he also sees creativity as a great leveler of people. People from all walks, people from all different backgrounds, genders, different sexual orientations, name it, and that it, are leveled. They are equalized in light of creativity. And he also says we don't know where the next Andy Warhol or Jimi Hendrix is going to come from, where he or she will be from, and how he or she will join the society. So we don't know how these people came from the countries and contributed in the new cultures that they forced, let's say. So most of the artists that have chosen this path have contributed greatly in new cultures that they adopted. That's why I took this path. I tried to follow this path and talk to the artists and learn their experiences. Because I thought we could learn from what they lived through to improve several things. This is not actually interviews in a journalistic sense. It is user research interviews, trying to empathize with people, understanding deeper their problems, their concepts. And as one of my participants said, an Italian architect living in Turkey, he said, it's not about the languages as much as it is about the concepts that have to match when you are integrating in a new culture. So these are definitions of home from many artists that have participated in this research that match at some points. They are different at many points. But what I'm trying to do as a researcher is to look for the similarities and the differences so that we can understand, we can develop this artistic migrant persona, again, a design term that said that this virtual person that we create so that we can develop the experience for that person. But this is practically what I'm trying to do. And that is why I carried out these in-depth interviews, asking people the misunderstandings that they lived, the qualities of communication that they have, what happened in their preliminary interactions with people, what were the language barriers they had, which is, of course, an important point. Yes, the concepts have to be shared, but if you don't speak the language, then it is a huge problem. So what ranges of behavior and sets of values have to be observed, explored? What are the touch points that create the cultural context? Most of the time, just to give you an idea of the depth of the research or the interviews, most of the time it happens at a meal, at a table that they shared with another culture, the misunderstandings and the cultural conflicts. And most people were very hurt by these misunderstandings when they happened. I also devised a kind of a workshop to see how this works, because knowing after all this research, knowing that it mostly happens at a meal, the table, I wanted to go into it. And a couple of months ago, I had a workshop in Paris. Normally, I interview people one-to-one because I want them to have privacy and I want them to trust me so that we can go into these subjects. But we had a workshop in Paris and I was thinking, like, we should be eating something so that we have these conditions, we can have an experience of eating together. So I called it breaking bread in the end, because I wanted to minimize it to the simplest thing that we can eat without too many complications at the table, preparations or anything. So I asked everyone to bring a bread from their own culture, maybe their favorite bread in Paris or whatever, and everybody did. And I just put some olive oil on the table and we dipped our breads and we tasted the different breads of different cultures. And it did really serve as an icebreaker, as a conversation starter, as the opening of a gate for intercultural communication. So that is the kind of path that I'm trying to take with the results of this research, that people can devise this information to find these tiny experiences, maybe grassroots movements, to start these communications, to open these gates to other cultures, and to learn to be more open-minded, if that is the case. And when it comes to the fifth point here, how migrants construct the sense of home and belonging, that is yet to come. That is not as easy as it sounds, and it's not even easy when you haven't left your own culture, so it is yet to come. And here are some of the artists that are, these are the Cuba ones, so these are all artists from Cuba, but some of them are people who have migrated to Cuba. Some of them are Cuban artists that really want to migrate. And here are some of the findings. Because I was trying to define this persona, what are the qualities of this persona that is open to intercultural communication, that is open to have more empathy and tolerance towards the differences, diversities in a society. So of course, it has to start with having this opening to communication, not being open to communicate, the capacity to empathize with other people. These are scales on which I try to place the results of the interviews. Of course, there is the role of personal similarities and differences. There is the role of the stories that we tell. Storytelling is again a buzzword of the design world today, but it is through stories that we communicate, that we know one another. It is through stories that we make friends. So I have many questions in this work about that also. Does knowing the story of another person allow you to empathize or start the empathization, you empathizing with the other person? And well, I have all of these different scales, not to bore you with the details, but the most important thing that I realized out of this research is that these creative people, ranging from dancers to fashion designers to graphic designers, artists in the senses that we know, and many other architects, sometimes many other different creative people. When it comes to defining the other, that is the biggest problem that they have, because they don't identify a person that is different to them as the other. Instead, when somebody is different, they are more curious, they are more open to know and to explore. That's one of the things that strike me the most out of all of these interviews. That's where we stop empathizing, I think. When we say that somebody is the other, that's where we start putting the distance and start differentiating ourselves from the people that we are communicating with. That's what I learned. I don't know how I'm going with time, but I can talk for hours. That's my habit, being a design professor and talking to the students for 3 hours at least, and also talking to the computer a lot. So if I'm over time, stop me. If I'm not, okay, these are optional photos that I had in the end, in case you wondered what my school, my city looked like. This is a view from Izmir, Turkey. It is located on the Aegean Sea. This is a view from my faculty. This was actually the end of a graduation jury with my students, my colleagues. These are our studios, workshops. And these are works from my students. And these are my design works. And I think I managed to say what I wanted to say today. I don't know if I'm on time. And I think we can move on to your questions and to a lively discussion with dear Professor Avila, who kindly accepted to join me today. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arda, for the enlightening presentation. We moved to the question and discussion, question and answer session. I just want to remind everybody, we did provide everyone with the index card when they checked in. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and write them down, and we will go around and collect those from you. Thank you.
I can also project. I don't know if Sue can pick that up. Can everyone hear me? Can I project? All right. Thank you. So I have a lot of questions here, and I have a lot of questions here. Again, we have the index cards that you're more than welcome to ask your own questions, and we'll pick them up and we'll bring them to me, and I'll do my best to integrate them into the conversation. But my first question is kind of a logistical question regarding the interviews. When you approach these artists that you interview, what's their reaction? Do they feel like you're giving them a voice through the Exile, or how do they react to it?
That's a very good question. I mean, actually, it's not very difficult to approach them because we have partners in and we go and work with our partners, so they help us around getting in contact with the first artist, I would say, and then I start snowballing most of the time. So I meet one artist and I interview him or her. And this is a weird process because it's supposed to take 45 minutes an interview. I have calculated before I started doing them. Never takes 45 minutes. It takes at least 2 hours or 2 hours and a half. We start by shaking hands and we end up hugging one another, and sometimes tears are shed. And usually we have a coffee while we are having the interview. It ends up having a beer after, and it goes on for some more hours, and I become friends with most of them after interviewing them.
So does the interview process end at the interview, or do you continue to talk to them and interview them and learn from them over time?
I mean, not all of them. Sometimes I know some of them afterwards, but I become friends with them on social media most of the time, and yeah, it goes on one way or another. I have to keep their identities intact. I mean, I have to keep them anonymous. That's why I have the eyes covered also. Because of the European Union project rules. Most of the time they want to make it more fair. They actually want me to publish the interviews. They actually want their names to be shown as well. Most of the time they are not shy. They just want to go on communicating as they.
What do you think? What is it about art and artists, do you think?
We have another microphone ready.
What do you think it is about art and artists that makes some governments nervous that they need to be in the exile?
I saw a question about Ai Weiwei in the registration list also, yes. Yeah, artists have this way of touching the points that touch the society, that affects people, that touch their emotions, that activate them, that make them angry. So because they are capable of triggering emotions, which the governments do not like. I haven't seen any government that likes emotions. Like the more docile the people are, the better. But artists have a way of triggering that. And once triggered, it's something that cannot be put back. It's like the genie in a bottle. So if they trigger those points, if they start making people think and feel, of course, no government is going to like that. I include.
Do you think it's the responsibility of a designer and artist to push their work or have their work be part of that voice? And do you think they're capable? Do you think art is capable or able to help heal or help unite a divided world like ours is right now?
Very difficult ones. I don't know if I'm capable of answering all of that. It's a big bite. It would be very obnoxious to say that yes, it can. Anyway, but I think it is a step. It is a step towards starting any kind of dialogue. That's why we love art so much. That's why it's also in the part of it's also a part of the identity process. No? We identify ourselves with the things that we see in artworks, with the things that we hear, with the things they trigger, the stories that they tell, and then we start this process through identification, empathizing, putting ourselves in the shoes of the So it's not only triggering to, I don't know, create an army of activists, but it's also triggering this feeling, because if it is triggered in one human being, it is passed on to their family, to their friends, whatever. It's a very important tool to start any dialogue. And it's better because it seems innocent in the beginning, so it's easier to sneak it in than any other forms of starting dialogue. And when it comes to the designers and artists' responsibility, that was also a good question, so I'm not going to skip that. I think it's the responsibility of all human beings. But as artists and designers, because we have the tools, let's say the tools of manipulation, I always tell my students that they have to be very careful because they know how to visually manipulate. It even starts with what word you make bold in a presentation or in a poster or in the name of a movie. So we have the tools for manipulation, so we have to be very responsible in not hurting anyone, in not humiliating anyone. That's part of the responsibility. And then there's the part of voicing the concerns, which is more complicated, politically speaking. I come from a country where it's not safe to talk. I have to admit it. And it's been 9 years since we had the Gezi resistance, and I was very vocal back then. I was pushing the students were coming to me, we were going and resisting all together and a lot of stuff. And then I realized that it's going to be useless if I'm put in prison. Like, I'm not going to have the interaction that I have with my students. So was it going to be voicing my concerns and making them public through social media or other outlets, or was it going to be being able to spend time and have interactions with my students? I chose the latter. I chose to be with the students, so I can't say that I'm able to voice my concerns very well.
My next question, again, all these kind of tough questions, I'm just wondering about your opinion, but we keep using the terms art and design almost interchangeably. Do you think they're the same? Do you see them as different? And if so, what do you think the differences are?
I think it's all yes.
I have my opinion.
You're asking me, but I'm going to ask you your opinion as well. Well, in today's world, design has to serve a purpose, mostly a commercial purpose, or it has to fulfill a job. It has to deliver a message in one form or another, because design is something commissioned in today's world. And art seems to be more of a self-expression, a way of the artist's way, the artist putting out their work. But if we would go back 5 centuries, art was commissioned actually. Most of the masterpieces that we see in museums were not the artist's self-expression. So they're not that far apart. But yet again, design is standing in a more commercial position. But go to the NFTs, go to art being digitalized and being sold with singular colors and everything, still debatable. Let's say that they meet on the level of communication in different levels.
I tend to agree. This is from the audience. Why is it important to talk about artists in exile? And is there anything UCF students can do to help?
Oh, nice question. UCF students can do much to help. All students can do something to help. Maybe you can also organize a gathering. Maybe you can just take pens and pencils and put them on tables and call people to come in and start drawing or writing or something. Any invitation, any open door actually allows for the dialogue to start. Who will respond? You'll never know. Who will start what kind of interaction and how it will turn out, we never know. I never knew most of the things that happened to me in my life. Most artists that migrated didn't know that they were gonna become huge influences decades later. There's the exhibition in Orlando Museum of Art right now of Jean-Michel Basquiat. And he didn't know, as a child growing up in New York at that time of Haitian origins, he didn't know that it was going to be this influential. He didn't realize his compositions were so strong. But you can never lose with diving into art, literature. I always tell this to my students, that you always have to nurture your soul. You can't be satisfied with just going into classes, listening to what the professors have to say. First of all, you have to question everything all the time. Again, something that I tell my students. Don't believe everything you hear, even if it's me telling you that. Never take it as 100% correct. Always question, always look for the back doors to see what kind of outlets, and always nurture yourself something beyond Netflix. It's very ambitious.
Another question from the audience. In your slide describing home, what is the one thing that all your participants have in common?
That they are looking for it. Nobody describes it 100%, but everybody looks for it. And if you have left, let's say, your roots behind, it's even more worse that they're looking for it. But everybody's looking for it. Even though they try to describe it for the sake of answering my questions, I know that they are still looking.
Another question from the audience.
So many questions.
There's
I mean, that's many.
Do you use archetype as part of the conversation process? Which archetype? Maybe the person who asked the question can embellish.
Just the concept of archetype, I find it useful, and across it as a teacher in arts, I find it very helpful in students transcending the specificity of their vision to make more effective communication.
I don't start with the archetype, or I don't use it as a tool. I just start with a hello. I pretty much let them lead me. I try to. I'm not even asking. Sometimes I'm not even asking all the questions that I have in my head. So I just make it an open process, just letting them take the lead and teach me most of the time. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell us about your book project? How do you plan to proceed?
That's another difficult one. Thank you. Thank you. Bombarding me with questions. Well, it's nice on the other hand, because I think I missed being in a hall like this. So the book project, first of all, I have to have time to write it down, which is a scarce commodity when you have responsibilities in a department and you teach and you research and you go from here to there. So I will need to sit down, write it down. But the ideal thing, you have seen the beautiful images that my colleague has created, Nina. So ideally, I will try to define the chapters that I haven't done yet. But before the book, we had an exhibition as part of this project in November, December of last year. And we will have one more in Istanbul. So I want to put it together kind of as an artwork before I make it a book. Also encouraged by Nina, who is more of an artist than I am. And we want to make a kind of a door through which we hear a mixture of these recordings of the interviews, the sound mixing and some of them getting louder and lower and stuff. So first we want to work that out, and then maybe I'll sit down sometime and write it down. But I'll go back to Turkey next week, and next semester is going to start. So sleep less, run more. That's the kind of way.
We have another question from the audience. It starts with a comment. There's a paradox in the title, Artists in Exile. The word artist has such a joyful connotation, while exile sounds so heartbreaking and soul-wrenching. Do struggles help sharpen the saw, or do they hinder these artists' abilities? And we kind of saw the gentleman, the artist who does it with the rocks, and he was explaining that he uses what he has. But what are your thoughts?
Yes, artists in exile sounds sad and joyful. That's a nice definition. Very good contribution, actually. Thank you. Then we think of it, aren't artists always already in exile? And besides the physical conditions, even in their own culture, they are not. That's one of the questions actually in the interviews. Like, do you feel as if you completely belong to any culture? The new one, old one, the culture you adapted or the culture you left behind? Most of the time they say neither. So artists in exile is not that much of a physical concept, psychological one. So we don't have to have too many emotions about that.
Part of your research also includes communication studies based on the misunderstandings across language barriers. How do you think design helps bridge cultures? And can you give us an example of a mode of design that has successfully created such a bridge?
Really, I'm going to start to. Okay, design can get bridges, and it can for art and design and music and performing arts. All of those can bridge gaps. But let me give you an example by Oliver Elias. I don't know if anybody has seen this, but I think I saw it on sale in one of the museums around. Sorry. He designed a sunflower lamp, which charges itself with a small solar panel and which can be worn as a necklace. He didn't design it for the Western societies. He designed it for the African children. Actually, Oliver Elias being one of the most famous artists and designers of today, because he realized that they don't have light once it's dark. They cannot read at night. So all of the fancy designs that we can create, they're never going to work for these little African children. So he designed this lamp, which I think bridges too many things all at once. No? It tries to help them overcome the economical difficulties, the physical conditions, the circumstances that they are in. And also I like his sales strategy, because in the West we have to pay, I think, $30. They have to gather $1 or half a dollar in Africa to buy these lamps. Or when you buy one, you can send one, something like that. So he has different strategies to get that also, which could be a good example of bridging gap. One more thing to say could be design starts to empathize more when we started defining and developing the field of interaction design, actually. It still sounds a bit weird whenever I say interaction design. We got used to it because it's been more than 2 decades now. But when I was a student in Master of Interaction Design, we didn't even call it interaction design, we called it iDesign, so that it would have a nicer name to it with iPhone and iPad and everything. But with interaction design, because what we design is the actual behavior of people. The people and their experiences with technology, what they do, how they interact, what buttons they push, how they activate technologies. So once you start trying to design it, you understand that you know absolutely nothing. How they're going to respond, what level of user you have, what level of experience or education they have. what is their familiarity with technologies. So you have to learn to observe, you have to learn to understand the user, you have to empathize. I think it started bridging things. Design became more of a facilitator of communication through that.
So to springboard off of that question then, and a comment that you had made earlier, you were a city planner, and there's a saying that 99% of all great design is invisible. There's even a podcast named after 99% invisible. Do you think that's true? Do you think design should be invisible so that it doesn't distract, or how are your feelings, especially again as a city planner, you might have thought about that. How design should get away.
Before I started studying city planning, I thought everything happened by itself as a high school student. So what the city planners do is partly invisible. Don Norman has a great book called The Invisible Computer. And he says that the computer as a technology is still in its infancy because it's too obvious. Now we have to look at the screens, we have to click things. Now maybe by using Alexa and using voice commands, it starts to get a little softer. But I don't think design is invisible, or I'm not really sure that good design should be invisible. Good design should be intuitive, should be it's difficult to explain actually, but you feel it when you understand that the designer really thought about you when they developed that setting or that interaction for you. So, like if you find something exactly where it needs to be, you realize that there was an empathetic designer in the process, and that's the good thing about it. Not being visible in that sense, but accommodating.
Yeah, I think the famous example is when you go to a door and you find the handle that makes it seem like you have to pull the door, but the door only goes forward. That's kind of like the thing that Don Norman was talking about.
Yeah, the affordances that we have. That can be very misleading. I'm not really into that definition of design.
Fair enough.
We don't have to
Fair
agree
enough.
with all together. Designers, there are so many of us.
All right. And I think we have time for one last question. You described, and we describe ourselves a lot of times as creative people, creative persons. What is living a creative life, even outside of your job, outside of your schools? What does living a creative life mean to you?
First of all, you also know that once you're a designer, once you're an artist, you work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It never stops. You can't turn it on and off. So you're observing all the time. You have to be looking at things. You filter many things in different ways. You know things that most people that go unnoticed to most people. So I lost track of the question. Sorry.
No,
Yes.
you're perfect. You're perfect. It was just, what is living a creative life mean to you?
I most of the time realize that I use the cell phone as a visual memory because I see so many things that I want to keep. So I go like photographing little details and then looking at them and putting the pieces together somehow. I think it means mostly being open all the time to all stimuli. And then there was the famous saying by how can I forget his name? It's one of my favorites. Anyway, if you are too open-minded, then people can put all kinds of trash. Sorry, I forgot the owner of the.
That's a great quote. That's a great way to finish. Thank you so much. We appreciate you.